I want to talk and address the House on a more serious note this afternoon, and it has to do with not the economy, doesn't have to do with money, the debt, all those things that many Americans and all Americans are concerned about, but it's dealing with something that to me is serious, if not more serious, because it has to do with people, children primarily. And what I'm talking about is something that we thought doesn't happen in this country anymore, and that's slavery. Yes, we still have slavery throughout the world today in 2014. It's called human sex trafficking. And what we're talking about, and what I'm talking about, has consequences throughout the United States. It's not just happening in foreign countries. It's not just isolated and happening a little bit. The scourge is happening throughout the world, and yes, has even come to the United States. That's one reason why this is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. And it's vital that mothers and fathers understand the crime of human trafficking. I have 4 kids. I have 11 grandkids. Children are the greatest resource that the country has. And things are happening to them that a lot of Americans are unaware of. And it happens in our neighborhoods. And here's how it happens. Small example that happened in Houston. Young girl goes to the mall, like teenagers do, middle schoolers. Parents drop kids off at the mall on a Saturday, for example, and then come pick them up later in the day. The young girl was there with some others. She got to talking to a young male. And when we think of sex traffickers, a lot of people think of the old guy in the trench coat. No. Many of them are young people. Good-looking guy in his early 20s. He starts talking to this young girl. Before you know it, they hit up a good conversation. And he starts telling her things that she wants to hear. He buys a few things for her there in the mall. And before you know it, she's picked up, and he and this young girl, this middle schooler, go somewhere in a car. But they disappear into the Houston community because now she has been kidnapped and is used, unfortunately, in the sex trade, in the sex slavery trade, as a young teenage girl. They are located, these traffickers. They'll find young girls anywhere. They'll find them at salons. They'll go to massage parlors. Their human trafficking occurs in many different places. Sometimes fronts. There are storefronts that are for one business, but it's nothing more than a trafficking outlet of sex trafficking. And traditional businesses, unfortunately, are nothing more than fronts for forced prostitution of minors. And they are held and forced to have sex with others for money, so the trafficker can get money. And that filthy lucre goes to the slave trader. It happens in far-off places. It happens in America. And the victims, and that's the ones I want to talk about today, they're domestic victims in the United States, like the girl I mentioned in Houston, and they're international victims in other countries. And they are trafficked into the United States or throughout the United States for 2 purposes: for sex or for labor, forced labor. And I have recently been to Central America and South America, Honduras and Guatemala, Rica and Panama, and even Peru. And I have been able to see the sex trade, the sex trafficking business in those countries. It happens domestically in those countries as well as other countries throughout the world. But some of those girls are forced to come to the United States. Not all of them, but some of them are. And be mindful, we do have girls in the United States that are transported throughout the country, domestic sex trafficking. But I got to talk to some of these young girls in these shelters about their lives. I met one girl, I asked her, how did this happen to you? And she said, well, when I was 9 years old, my mother sold me to a trafficker for a cell phone. And she got sold for a phone for Mom, and then once she goes into the sex trafficking business. After they reach a certain age, then they just disappear into the society. This girl was rescued in Guatemala. And there are shelters that help these young girls. I got to talk to several of these girls, and we're talking about the youngest that I met was 7, and they go all the way up to 17 to be minors. But I got to talk to some girls, 5 of them in one shelter, that were 12 years of age or younger, 5 of them. There were other girls in the shelter. These 5 girls I talked to, Mr. Speaker, all had children that were the product of forcible rape by one of the customers that had abused them. It's sex slavery. It's sex trafficking throughout the world. And they're forced into terrible, abusive conditions, whether it's work slavery or whether it's prostitution, forced prostitution. But there are also young women, and males too, but primarily young women, that are trafficked in our own neighborhoods for sexual servitude. As many as 100,000 children in the United States a year are at risk for sexual exploitation. And worldwide, Mr. Speaker, trafficking is a billion-dollar business. It's a $32 billion business a year. That's just a number. But what does that mean? That trafficking criminal activity is second only to the narcotics trafficking in the United States or in the world. And the difference between trafficking of or selling drugs is that when you sell drugs, the product is sold one time. But when you traffic young children, the trafficker sells that young child numerous times a day. And the consequences are much less for trafficking children than it is for trafficking drugs. That's another issue we need to resolve. But the consequences are something that keeps this dastardly crime operating. Mr. Speaker, these traffickers are so bold that they brand these young girls with tattoos so that other traffickers, or pimps, whichever you want to call them, know that this property belongs to this trafficker. And they'll brand them somewhere on their body. The New York Times, Mr. Speaker, has reported that a girl in New York City was branded with a barcode so that her trafficker could keep up with her whereabouts. Barcodes. Barcodes are put on property. And I think this should be disturbing that this is happening to young children in the United States. Traffickers, where do they operate? They operate wherever there's a business. And unfortunately, they operate at big sporting events like the Super Bowl. New Jersey and New York have done an excellent job preparing for this year's Super Bowl by warning parents, warning children, warning people who come to New York about the issue of sex trafficking, especially of children. So what can we do? What should we do about this issue that's taking place in other countries and the United States? The first thing we need to do is to treat these children like criminals, like victims rather than criminals. They are treated like criminals. When the police go out and they go into an area and they raid that area, they take these girls who are forced into prostitution. Many times they file criminal charges on them. Now, in all fairness to the police, there's not places to put trafficking victims. There's just not enough shelters. But they're treated and observed by community as criminals as opposed to victims. So we must change the mindset and the laws in this country to treat them as victims, because that's what they are. They're victims of criminal conduct. They are not